Hello everyone, I'm Shahin Sultana, QA engineer from Kovia Insurance, based in Reading, London, UK. Your host for today. Welcome to QA Talks community. Our vision is to collaborate and share the experience about testing skills. Our community mission is sharing knowledge and experience to communicate through our events and conferences. Here we go, Blogger of the Month. You can join our blogger space if you are good at writing and win a chance and stand a chance to be a Blogger of the Month. Moving on, if you are our upcoming conferences, our upcoming conference is Codeless Conference 2022. For details, please visit our website, or you can find on our social media platforms like LinkedIn, Twitter. You can also share. You can also have the information on QA Talks website. If you're good at so our if you're looking for an opportunity to be a speaker, please share your details like abstract and keynotes with us on our website to be part of our next conference. You can join our courses at Technox Training. Here are our community sponsors. Lambda Test is our gold sponsor and Metiroids is our bronze sponsor. Our community donators, Test Compass and QTube. Our certification sponsor, Certify Me Online. Our community partner, Agile Testing Alliance, Select a Hub, Testing Tech News, Testomate IO, and POA Testing. These are few housekeeping rules. If you have any questions, please type in the comment section. Feel free to chat in our comment section to make new testing friends. All your questions will be answered in our Q&A session. You can follow us on our various social media platforms for update about our QA Talks next conferences or any other details. Here on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Now let's welcome our speaker George, who works as an AVP Quality Engineer, DevOps, and SRE at Mir Labs. He did various certifications, and he is a certified test engineer and a certified ELT tester. He is also a Microsoft certified trainer and many more. Who's going to speak about production feedback analysis? Over to you, George.
Thank you, Shaheen. Uh, Let me check on my deck. Yep. I hope everyone is able to see my deck.
Yes, it is visible.
Okay. So thank you for the opportunity, QA Talk team. So I'll just introduce myself once again. My name is George. I am an AVP with Mar Labs. I work out of the Kochi office. I've spent close to 2 decades in the software test engineering as well as in the DevOps space. And the topic for the day is basically production feedback analysis. So what we're going to cover today is basically three different aspects around production feedback analysis. The first part is basically going to talk about why is that we should be doing production feedback analysis in the first place. Second thing is basically how is that I can actually do it, or what are the ways in which I can actually do production feedback analysis. Third aspect is what are some of the benefits that you would actually get while implementing this practice, and also look at what are some of the challenges that I would actually face when you try to implement this in your projects or across your products. Okay, so let's start off by just looking at why is that we need to do production feedback analysis. So it's a very interesting topic, and primarily many of us would not have used this practice in our career, primarily because once your application is actually moved into production, unless you're actually working in a product-based organization, you may not have a lot of role to play, especially if you are someone who's working in a services industry. So once your project is done, once you have done your user acceptance test, once the testing team has signed off, unless there's a warranty support required, you may not have a role to play within a product team or within a project team. But if you're working in a product organization, yes, you may continue to work on the next release, and you may also be involved in actually testing production patches as well as in analyzing the critical defects or the serious defects that have come in from production. So Having said that, it's quite different scenario now. This practice would have been okay maybe some time back, but in the current scenario of applications moving into digital, you have a lot of cloud-based applications. You need to actually focus on what is happening in production after you've actually deployed your application there. So there are multiple reasons due to which it is important. One is basically the expectation of your end user or your end customer is very different now. So maybe when I started my career, maybe way back in 2000, the focus of testing was primarily around functional aspects, and it was not the non-functional aspects, or maybe like I would say 10 to 15 or 20% of the overall effort that you would put in inside a testing, what do you call, project. So right now the scenario is very different. You actually have almost equal focus for both functional testing as well as for non-functional testing. You spend a lot of time around performance. You look at security aspects. You look at user experience as well as usability. You're also looking at the resiliency of applications. So now the expectation of the user has actually made us do all of these things in our project. So the focus has just moved away from functional to both functional as well as non-functional aspects, and we should be actually focusing on validating those. So at the same time, it's also important to actually know what your end users are thinking about your product, and that's the reason why we should be actually looking at the feedback coming in from production. And the other important aspect is the cost of downtime is very high, in the sense like it can range anywhere between $130,000 of loss per hour to around $540,000 per hour, which is almost like half a million. So the availability of application is very key in today's world. Most of these applications are either web-based or what do you say, responsive kind of apps that you're having. And it's important to maintain at least 4 nines of availability so that you don't actually end up losing revenue or your employee productivity. So keeping a track of your application performance also becomes a very important aspect, and that's the reason why availability is actually a priority. And it's also important to actually reduce the cost of rework. So if you're able to find and fix issues upfront, you can actually reduce a lot of your effort that might come in on support work as well as in remediation. So we can actually look at proactive ways of finding and fixing issues that actually reduces the overall rework ratio. And production monitoring as well as analysis would actually help us to a great extent to bring down the cost of what you call bug fixes or ticket fixes. And the other important aspect is in today's world, the amount of time that you get for performing your test or to conduct different types of non-functional and functional tests is very limited. If you're working in an agile model, you hardly get 2 to 3 weeks of time in order to complete your testing. And it's not always possible to actually test 100% of your application in that time frame. So it's very important to look at what is that is important for my application and then adopt a risk-based testing strategy. And this technique around feedback analysis will definitely help you to focus on the key areas of your application. It can be in terms of functionalities, or it can be even on the basis of different types of testing that you may need to perform on your application. And the other important aspect is we are all used to corrective and preventive actions, which is basically like proactively looking at preventing issues from happening as well as correcting issues once you notice them. So a lot of you would have already done defect root cause analysis and things like that in the past. So defect is definitely one of the feedbacks that you get on your application quality from production. So corrective and implementing corrective and preventive actions is also one important aspect that you may need to consider when it comes to production feedback analysis. But what are sources from where I can actually extract this information? So what is a production feedback? So there are a lot of ways in which I can extract feedback about my application behavior, as well as I can also get information about usage patterns from maybe maybe 6 or 7 different sources. But in the interest of time, I've just limited to 5 areas. One is basically customer support tickets, or basically production ticketing system, from where you can actually extract information about your application quality. You can also get a lot of inputs about your application quality as well as how your users are actually feeling about your application from social media. And if you're actually dealing with a mobile native app, an app store is a very good source of information for you to extract information. And then you also have a wide range of APM tools, or application performance monitoring tools, which can actually give you information about your application performance in terms of speed, responsiveness, as well as availability. And then you also get a lot of information about your application, what you call, again, usage patterns, what is being used, what features are being actually looked upon by customers. All of those aspects can be extracted from Your website analytics, a good example can be a Google Analytics plugin, or it can be even the web server log files. So these are some of the sources from where you can actually get a lot of feedback about your application usage as well as your customer feelings. It's not just limited to these files. You can also do a log analysis of both your application log files. You can also look at surveys as well as other ways to actually analyze feedback. But in the interest of time, I've just limited to these five topics today. Let's actually start off with ticketing analysis, or what is it I can do with production tickets. So production tickets are mostly logged in, or they're actually entered by an engineer who's actually working in your support team. Or in some cases, there might be a mechanism using which customer emails are actually converted into tickets. Or your IT engineers, one of the engineers who's actually working on your application might notice something, and he or she can also enter tickets. So there are multiple ways in which you can actually be creating tickets in your system. And then what is that you primarily do with these tickets is of importance. So the traditional method was to basically look at doing analyzing tickets to just find out the trends of defects that are coming in. That too, you do this maybe mostly once in a year or so. And then you also may do maybe a defect root cause analysis. If you're actually working in industries like life sciences or healthcare, you may actually do what do you call a defect root cause analysis process just to satisfy your process compliance team or your validation team. But other than that, very rarely people use this information to improve the product, because we are quite what do you call busy with our next release. We rarely focus on what has happened for your application release that has already gone into production. But that's not the case. There are a lot of things that you can actually do with the data that is coming in from your production ticketing tools. So ticketing tool, a good example of a ticketing tool can be a tool like Jira Service Desk, or it can be a service now where your developers or where your support engineers might be entering tickets. So what is it I can do with these tickets? The first thing that you can look at is basically, as I was mentioning earlier, you can actually look at the trend of defects that have come in production. It can be a weekly trend to understand like how many defects came in this week. Was there an upward trend or was there a downward trend in defects? Or you can actually tie it to a release. For example, I released a product release. I made a release of my product last week. Am I actually getting an increased number of tickets after it was actually pushed into production? Normally, that's the case. Every time you put in a major release into production, you basically get a spike in the number of tickets because users may start reporting some of these issues. And then eventually it actually flattens or it actually comes down. But if you're putting a very minor patch into production, there should not be an increase in production tickets. So a defect trend analysis will actually help you to find issues of that sort. And at the same time, root cause analysis is another important thing that you can do with your defects. So primarily, there are multiple techniques that were actually employed in the past to actually do defect root cause analysis. The most popular ones were things like practices like Pareto analysis. We had 5 whys techniques. There is also technique like fishbone diagram creation. All of those techniques were used, but they are very, very called cumbersome kind of processes, in the sense like you need to spend a good amount of time with the team in order to at least do the first level of analysis. So root cause analysis also is important, but since it's a more cumbersome process, people just do it for process sake, and it was not actually coming out to what do you call it? It was not actually helping out the development team or the testing team to improve the product. But in today's world, there are a lot of ways in which you can actually what do you call improve this process, which I'll come on to. I'll discuss about that in a minute. And the next thing that you can look at is basically I'm seeing defects in my products. So what features of my applications are buggy? So where am I actually getting a lot of this what do you say products? So where am I actually getting what do you call which part of my application is actually giving me defects, or is it coming in from maybe from my payment application? Now let's take an example of a healthcare app. So there are various modules that an healthcare or a medical app can have. Look at maybe patient administration as one module. You can actually have maybe ordering test as one of the other key modules. You may have a resulting module, you may have a reporting module, and you may have maybe something like an administration module. So what can actually happen is basically like if you are able to do the ticket classification, it becomes very important for a person. It's a very important information that you can extract, where you can actually get information about what capabilities of your application are actually having issues. For example, I released something into production last week. Am I actually getting issues from that particular feature that went into production last week, or people complaining about a type of issue? For example, I can actually classify my tickets into maybe 4 different categories. Functional issues. I can actually look at maybe things like performance issues, usability issues, or security issues. So what kind of issues are actually coming in production? So the classification of tickets into various categories based on maybe different types of testing or based on product capability, something that I can do. But is it possible to actually do this in a manual mode? Definitely not. It is actually going to take a lot of operational overhead in order to do this, because depending on your product, you may have to actually keep a full-time person just to do this stuff, which is not economical. So the best thing to do is basically there are a lot of what I call libraries available in Python that actually helps you to what do you say do this classification of defects. There are multiple algorithms like support vector machines, you have random forest algorithms, you have something called k-nearest neighbor. All of these classification algorithms can actually help you to do multiple things. One is basically it can be used for classifying your tickets into various categories based on your product functionality or based on a criteria like usability, functionality, security, or performance. You can also look at finding the most probable root cause of a defect based on your historical data. You can also look at finding out the best developer who can actually fix a defect. In the sense, like you may have hundreds of tickets coming in to for your product, and it may be very difficult to actually assign tickets automatically to a developer. And the best thing to do is to basically look at whether your developer has actually fixed such an issue in the past, and then assign this defect to that particular person so that the defect fixing cycle time can be reduced. There are a lot of things you can think about from the defect analysis that you can actually do, or from the ticket analysis that you can do. The important aspect to keep consider here is when you're actually considering defects for what you call analysis, just exclude defects that are not related to your product. There can be customer queries, there can be change requests, there can be customization requests coming in from customers. You may have to exclude all of those items when you're actually planning to do this kind of an analysis. And if you want to develop a system around production defect analysis, it is not something that is going to take years together. With a couple of developers, you can at least implement the first version, maybe I would say in 2 to 3 months of time, maybe with 2 or 3 developers. Let's actually take a look at how this application would look like. This is basically a custom application or a dashboard that I've created. I've not seen a lot of industry products or a lot of commercial products that has come up with such kind of a capability, but I've experienced doing this with custom apps. A very simple dashboard that actually shows the tickets, what do you call, categorized by issue type. The second graph is basically showing tickets classified based on a product capability or feature. This is primarily coming in from a retail application. So what you can see is it's basically showing around 5 capabilities of your product, and basically showing a weekly trend of what are different capabilities that actually had issues in every week. And then you also have another representation which actually talks about the probable root cause of issues. Again, this is based on the historical data. It only gives you a guidance. It is not 100% foolproof because your root cause may differ. It has a human, what you call, element attached to it. And then you also get a summary of your defects. And then you can also see that there is an increasing trend. For example, the fifth graph that you have is basically a ticket trending graph, which basically shows a hike in the third week. The primary reason for that is because there's a new release that has gone into production, and you basically have a spike, but it later settles down. So these are the kind of things that you may need to look at. And then there's also a guidance sheet for the manager to actually look at the best person who can actually fix a ticket or a defect. So it'd be based on the previous fixes that has been done. You're actually having a ticket number that is being assigned to a person or a developer inside your team. So this is an example of a ticketing analysis dashboard, and this primarily helps your developer or your support team as well as your test engineering team in order to improve the quality of product by actually looking at what is actually happening. For example, if I know that I'm having issues with respect to usability, that means that my next release or my current release, the usability testing that was done was not enough, and I should be focusing more on that particular aspect for my next release. Or the inference that I can make from a product capability kind of a view or a functionality view is maybe my checkout functionality is having a huge number of defects in the last release. Maybe when I'm doing regression testing, or I should be actually at least doing one more test cycle internally to make sure that the checkout feature is bug free. So these are the kind of inferences that a test engineer or a test manager or an architect should be inferring when you actually look at some of these, what do you call, graphs or some of these dashboards. So now let's actually look at a different aspect. So now we saw the ticketing angle, which is more reactive in the sense like the issue happened and then you're actually taking corrective action. Now you're actually looking at feedback coming in from your end users. So in today's world, I don't think any of the new generation shoppers or what do you call your customers would be interested in looking at the option of maybe calling up a customer support team when your product is not functioning or when your product is slow, and then giving them feedback, nor they would be ready to actually send an email to the customer support help desk talking about a problem. The first thing that a person would do, or a new generation, or even the old generation folks like doing, is basically look at how is that I can actually post about this issue in a social media forum, preferably a forum like Twitter or Facebook. Or if it's a mobile app, I may even do it inside an app store like a Google store, or an Android store, or an Apple store. So the primary feedback that you're getting about your application quality is not just your customer support help desk, either in the form of an email or calls. You should also look at social media, which may have wealth of information about your product quality, as well as what your customers are thinking about. And again, if you're looking at something like a mobile app, there are multiple things that you can actually have. For example, you may actually have people putting in rating of your application, or you may actually have people or your customers putting in what you call feedback about your application. And all of these things are important. And what are the things that I can do from these two sources? So the primary sources are basically social media forums. It can be Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, Pinterest, any of those forums. And then you actually have app stores, which is basically an Android store or an Apple store, an iOS store, depending on the support that you're offering for your mobile app. And what are the information that I would actually infer from this? So basically, I can look at the comments that have been posted in those forums. I can actually go through the comments and then find out what are the different problems that people have talked about. Maybe I can do the same level of classification, like classifying the comments or feedback into various categories, like different types of testing, or classifying the issues into maybe product functionalities that I might have. These are two things that you can actually do with the feedback. Then I can also analyze the feedback and then look at the emotion of the user, which is basically like you can do an emotion analysis as well as a sentiment analysis. So what kind of comment was it? Was it a positive comment? Was it a negative comment? Or was it what you call a neutral kind of comment that your customer has actually posted? I can look at the App Store rating and then see whether my App Store rating has actually increased in the last 1 month after I put in my latest version, or has it declined? Or I can also look at my overall rating. What is my rating across my product for the last maybe 1 year of time? And I can also look for precise words. The words can be basically like you may have some interesting words, which is basically like the good things that your people are talking about your product, or maybe certain capabilities of your product that users like. So that's basically called interesting facts about your product. And then you also have critical words, which is basically negative words, or people are complaining about something, which can be actually classified as maybe another category of what you call comments that your negative users or people with negative sentiments have actually posted. So there's a wealth of information that you can actually extract from these two sources, and all of them actually conveys a real feeling of your end user. So you may not actually get the same level of feedback if you actually look at the traditional mechanisms that were in place to collect feedback, which are basically having focus groups, maybe with selective customers. You basically go and talk to them, call them for a lunch or a dinner or a tea, and then talk to them to understand how they feel using their product. It might be useful maybe from a user experience kind of a view, but it may not be useful to improve your product to a great extent. One is basically it is very tough to get user time. Second thing is the number of people that you can interview is very limited. So there are various pitfalls that you may have for the traditional approach. And the other approach is basically surveys. Hardly people spend time on surveys. You get hundreds of emails every day asking for product feedback and customer support ratings, product ratings. Unless there's a reward attached to it, your customers may not bother. So these two forums, or these two sources of information that I was talking about, like social media as well as app store, should be actually considered very seriously, because that is where majority of the new generation customers might actually put in their feedback. So this is an example of a social media sentiment dashboard that I extracted from a tool called Brand24, which is basically used for social sentiment analysis. There are various data. I just put in one screen. There is wealth of information that you can extract from here. This tool is not specific for testing, but there are a lot of interesting information that you can actually extract. For example, the number of mentions about your product that has come in the last couple of weeks. You can also find out the sentiments of the user, whether it's a positive sentiment or a negative sentiment. You can also find out the sources from where this information has been extracted. There are a lot of information that you can actually get from a tool like Brand24, which might actually help us to do better testing, at least for the next release. And if you look at the similar data that comes in from maybe from an app store, what you can see here is basically there are multiple what you call elements that are actually displayed. One is basically there's an overall score that is being displayed for your app, and there's also a trend where there's a slight decline in the App Store rating since last couple of what you call days. And this rating is actually taken from the App Store. Most of you would be familiar with an app in India called Cred, which is used for credit card payments, and I've actually extracted the feedback from the Google Store or the Android Store. And there are a lot of what you call positive things about this. There is what you call, if you look at the overall sentiments of users, maybe I would say like more than 50% of the people are actually happy using the product. And then they're also looking at what you call some interesting facts as well as some interesting what you call keywords that are actually used. And you can also see a scatter plot towards the right that actually shows the emotions of the user. There are users, it's actually having two quadrants. One is basically an active, what do you call, as well as passive kind of comments. It has been plotted, and then you also have users being plotted on the x-axis based on whether they are pleased or displeased. So majority of the people who are not happy will be actually coming in the quadrant where they are displeased, and they actually are very assertive about their comments. So this is a good source of information for you to understand what people are talking about. And then you also have the overall sentiment scores. You also have a classification around the critical words that the users are actually talking about. And then you also have divided your social sentiments into what do you call positive and negative over it weekly trend. So there's a lot of information. If you pay attention to it, you might be able to use a lot of this information to actually see what your users are feeling about your product, which is very useful for you to define your strategy for the next release. So now we have actually covered tickets. We've actually covered the analysis about social media as well as App Store feedback, and now we are moving on to another interesting aspect, which is mostly non-functional nature, which is basically application performance. So there are a lot of organizations, mature organizations that I've seen that I've worked with in the past, who actually had a performance engineering team, and one of their responsibilities was to actually monitor performance of applications in production, especially in scenarios where you have an online business as well as, or maybe you're someone who's actually doing a retail store kind of a business where the holiday season is very critical for you to generate revenue, and it's very important to actually maintain uptime 5 nines at least during the holiday season. So performance monitoring is a key component in such organizations, and the engineering team, the performance engineering team, was actually responsible for it. Whereas in other organizations, it's mostly managed. The application monitoring team itself monitors the performance of the application. But it's actually good to monitor this performance on on a real-time basis, either using a test engineering or a performance engineering team, or have a dedicated person do this if you actually have if you are too dependent on your online business. But what do you actually monitor? It depends based on the application. But there are various aspects in today's world. You actually have a lot of applications running on the cloud, basically in Kubernetes or on Docker instances. So your infrastructure monitoring is very important. You may need to actually monitor your databases. You may need to actually monitor your Docker instances as well as some of your application components. So you can actually monitor the critical parameters of your application. Maybe it can be in terms of CPU utilization, memory utilization, thread count. All of those parameters can be actually monitored using an APM tool. It can be a tool like Azure monitoring services that you might have if you have deployed your application into the Azure cloud. And the other important aspect that you can actually look at is basically look at a tool like maybe App Dynamics or New Relic, which can actually give this kind of information to you. And some of these tools like New Relic also has the capability to actually do health checks on a regular basis, maybe every 5 minutes, across your instances deployed across the globe. So availability test is also something that you should be doing to actually make sure that your application is not down and it is actually behaving in a proper manner. Your application support team might have set thresholds. You can actually tell them to include you in those email alerts that you might get. There are two types of thresholds that they might be using. One is basically a static threshold, which is basically an alert that you might get if your, for example, if your CPU utilization is going beyond 80%. You may actually get an email alert, which actually is a way of actually proactively finding out whether there's something going wrong. So your testing team also needs to be part of those kind of alerts, or it can be dynamic alert. Dynamic alerts are not alerts that you set based on a predefined threshold. Maybe it's something like there is an odd behavior that is actually being shown by your application, and using some anomaly detection algorithms, you basically find out there is an issue that can actually happen, and then you actually set the proactive alert, which is basically called dynamic thresholds or dynamic triggers. So these thresholds also is very important. Setting those thresholds, being aware of what the thresholds are, and then being part of the team that gets alerted also gives you a wealth of information. So it's actually a good, what do you call it, can be a good input for your performance testing for the next cycle. If you're a test architect, it might actually give you information around some of the areas of your application where you might need to do additional performance testing. So all of those things needs to be inferred from your, what do you call, the monitoring that you're doing on your application performance. So it's not this application, it can be infrastructure as well as any other kind of what you call platform monitoring that you may need in that you may have in place. So this is a very simple example from the Azure monitoring dashboard. What you can see here is basically there is a dip in the application performance. The number of users have actually dipped. At the same time, we can actually see some kind of correlation. So many of these, the correlation is very important. For example, when there is a huge number of failed results, definitely your availability of your application was actually low as per this graph. It's just a sample graph. So it's very important for you to find this correlation. For example, there are too many requests that are actually turned down during a specified time. At the same time, the number of failed, the availability of the application was low, or the application performance was low during that time frame. So all of these are basically things that you need to correlate. Many of the modern APM tools have this capability of correlation, but otherwise you may have to do this. It's a very tedious task to look at multiple parameters and then do correlation. But automatic correlation really helps to find out root causes of problems, or at least it helps you to troubleshoot and find out where the problem is. Similar to this, it's not just limited to infrastructure alone or performance alone. If you're again, this is from an Azure monitoring dashboard where they have integrated this with a security monitoring tool also, where it is actually talking about security threats. It's also looking at the operating system hardening aspects. For example, it's actually telling you that there are patches that need to be installed on your application and things like that. So it's very important to actually look at those aspects as well from an infrastructure as well as network standpoint. It's also looking at network performance, because that's another important aspect that you need to keep in mind. If your application is actually in a slow network, your users might actually have problems. At the same time, you're also looking at what you call whether the systems are actually up to date, whether the patches are there. All of those things are actually monitored. So this dashboard gives you what you call information about the performance of your app from an infrastructure, from a real application perspective. It also looks at the platform, what you call the operating system components, how updated they are. It also looks at the security aspects. There is a what you call an assessment that is done based on the security integrations that are available. So it's actually complete monitoring, and this feedback is really will help you to actually improve on your non-functional aspect, especially performance, resiliency, as well as what do you say, the security aspects of your application. Moving on, the last area that we might have is basically the analysis of your usage, or how my users are actually using the app. So it can be like you're actually having a website that is actually hosted and you have a Google Analytics plugin. So most of the cases, its analytics plugins are actually not even looked by, or the data coming in from these plugins are not used by the testing team to a great extent. It is mostly used by your sales team or your marketing team to plan for campaigns, or sometimes your support teams might be interested to look at maybe page errors or the pages that are being actually what they call timed out and things like that. But it's rarely used for improving the testing process. But there is a lot of information that actually helps you to improve process, as well as helps you to focus on. There's a lot of data that can actually help you focus on the real what you call areas where you might need additional testing. So it can be in terms of what it can be in terms of finding out what kind of browsers are being used most by my users, what percentage of my users are actually using mobile applications or tablets, and what percentage of users are actually using desktop-based applications. For example, I'm getting an inference that 90% of my users are actually focusing on digital applications, or they're actually accessing my website from a mobile device. It might make sense to actually do a lot of thorough testing on your digital, devices, rather than just spending time on running your test on a desktop-based browser. Or it can be in terms of screen resolutions. You want to actually do a test around the look and feel of your application, as well as the form factor validation needs to be done. At that particular point of time, you should actually look at what my users are using. And if your application has been in production for quite some time, this really helps you. It may not be possible to do this for your first version, but over a period of time when your users are actually using your application, all of this information becomes very useful. And the other important aspect is how much of time are my users spending on my website? What kind of pages are they accessing? How much time are they spending per page? How many users are actually coming back to the website? All of these are very useful information, which almost we ignore this kind of information that we have, and then we just create a test strategy or a test plan document just by looking at the product requirement. But that's not the case. It is going forward. Let's actually think about something, what do you call that, is useful from the end customers also. Look at how they are using my application and then plan for my test, rather than just assuming things and then spending a lot of time. This is a good example of a dashboard that is being extracted from Google Analytics again. It need not be Google Analytics alone. There are other analytics platforms that actually helps you to extract the information. In some cases, if you have a log file from your web server, you can actually analyze the log file and get the same level of information. So this dashboard actually gives me information about my users, what percentage of my users are coming in from Android, what is iOS, what is web. I can also find out like the average time my users are actually spending, from what kind of operating systems are they joining, what kind of devices are they using? Are they actually using mobile devices, or are they using tablets? Are they also using what kind of browser? This really helps you to plan your cross-browser testing. For example, if my majority of my users are on Chrome, and maybe there are only certain users who are actually using something like an Opera browser or an Internet Explorer, why should I be spending time? Maybe like I would actually do maybe very minimal test case execution on maybe an Internet Explorer compared with maybe like I would execute all my test cases on a Chrome browser. So this gives you a lot of information, and you also get information around the screen resolution. I was talking about form validation or form factor validation. So this information is also going to be useful when it comes to screen resolution kind of testing that you may need to do. And there's a lot of other information that you can get if you're actually having what you call an app version. You can actually find out the behavior across app versions. If you have a mobile app, you can actually find out that information. And you can also get information about, if you're actually having a native app, you can also find out information about the device models that are using. There are thousands of models available, and every day there are 100 new models coming into the market. If you have this data with you, at least from a mobile testing standpoint, you can very well go ahead and actually what you call use this data in order to what you call plan for your testing. So I can very well go and say, I'm going to take a look at my Google Analytics data. I'm actually going to extract maybe 10 important mobile devices from that list, and then I'm going to run my next release testing on those devices. Because I only have 3 weeks of time or 6 weeks of time with me, I can plan that. So that's very what I call important aspect that you should be actually looking when it comes to defining your test strategy. Finally, what are some of the key benefits? We talked about a lot of things. So how do I get benefited out of this? One is basically if you're actually using an automated mechanism to do this classification of defects as well as reporting of defects, it's actually going to save a lot of time. You don't have to actually do what you call expensive. You don't have to spend a lot of time even to do what you call a detailed root cause analysis. You may have to spend maybe a couple of minutes to validate the findings given by the tool. So look at automating the entire process, and the objective is basically to reduce the operational overhead associated with what you call validating information or getting this information for your in the form that you need. The other important aspect is you're primarily looking at improving the overall quality of your application by actually looking at how is that I can actually make my application more what you call secure? How is that I can actually improve the availability of my application? Those are some of the benefits that you're going to get. So overall, this is definitely going to help you in terms of improving the quality of your application to a very great extent. It is also going to help you to reduce the overall cost. So cost in the sense in multiple ways. One is basically you're actually trying to reduce the overall cost of your application testing by actually finding out symptoms that you're seeing. It can be a symptom that you see maybe in an application monitoring tool or a performance monitoring tool, and you're actually taking proactive measures in order to fix them upfront. So your overall defect fixing cost is actually going to come down, because before a person reports this as a production ticket, you're actually taking corrective actions or preventive actions so that it doesn't actually impact other users. So cost of defect fixing is actually going to come down. And then the cost of testing also comes down. For example, if you're actually doing a risk-based testing approach by prioritizing maybe devices, form factors, as well as browsers, you're actually reducing the overall effort that you may need to spend for a particular release by actually prioritizing your testing based on the real data that is available for you. So the cost is actually reduced to a great extent by analyzing or by actually using this data that is available with you. The other important aspect is you can also look at improving the speed of defect triaging and resolution. If you're looking at automatic defect assignment based on the historical data from developers, it really helps you to cut down on your time. And it also helps you to define a robust test strategy. For example, you can actually focus on the types of testing that you need to do for your application based on what you've seen in production so far. You can look at what capabilities require a lot of testing. It can be in terms of page access. For example, you know that 100% of your users are actually using what you call maybe 3 pages for every workflow. So you can actually concentrate your testing around those 3 pages, or it can be in terms of improving your security testing or performance testing based on the data that has actually come in from your ticket analysis. So your test strategy can be made more robust and practical based on all this data that is available with you. And then finally, To be frank, it's not a cakewalk. Okay, so we've been talking about a lot of things. This requires a lot of focus and what do you call a change in mindset within the testing community. You may not get a lot of acceptance initially when you try to implement this in your organization. You may have to convince your stakeholders around the benefits as well as the amount of what do you call value that this might bring in on a long-term basis. You may have to actually wait for a couple of releases before you can actually see the real benefits coming in. So, what are some of the challenges that can actually come in? So one is basically like most of the leadership teams will actually have an inflated expectation in the sense like when you start implementing this, they would actually expect returns on day one, which may not be actually really possible. It may take, I was telling, like at least one or two releases to actually see the real value because everyone should get used to this process. Everyone should actually know what tools, people should know what tools should be actually, how tools should be used to extract this information. There's a lot of custom development also that you might need. For example, if you want to develop something like a defect analysis or a ticket analysis solution, you may have to go with a custom application development for which you may actually have to do something like data modeling. For example, you want to actually do classification for which you may need to actually create a data model. And most of the times, the data model creation itself will become a challenge because the ticket data or the production defect data that is given to your team for modeling may not be clear or may not be sufficient enough. Either the team won't be ready to give the data if you're actually working with a service provider. If you're on the service provider end, that is one problem that you might see. For example, if you want to do data modeling, you may ask your customer to provide you maybe 10,000 records, where the customer may give you maybe 10 or 15 records, which may not be sufficient from a volume perspective as well as from a quality perspective to do what you call a data modeling. Or the data quality itself is pretty poor in the sense like there are a lot of fields that are actually left empty. For example, you want to create a data model to do root cause analysis, and the root cause analysis field itself is actually empty in the defect dump that is given to you or in the ticket dump that is given to you. It's actually going to not going to give you the required result. So one is basically it's important to make sure that the data quality is good or the quality of data that is actually given to you is actually sufficient in terms of the fields that you require in order to do an analysis, and also in terms of volume. There should be enough volume as well as different combinations of data that is actually provided to you. Then only you're going to actually have accuracy in your data model or in a solution. The other important aspect is, so I've not seen a solution, to be frank, which actually does all of these things currently. For example, I've seen application that actually does App Store feedback analysis and social media sentiment analysis. I've seen those two being grouped, or those two capabilities being available in the same application. To some extent, I've actually seen performance monitoring tools actually have maybe all these aspects that we discuss about performance, but it may not have your ticket analysis capabilities, or it may not have user sentiment analysis kind of capabilities. So if you're looking at creating an integrated view of all information coming in from all these sources, I've not seen an application that actually has this, which does all of these. For example, another example is I've seen maybe web analytics as well as maybe what do you call performance monitoring combined in some of these tools like New Relic, but it doesn't have the other ticket analysis and other capabilities. So all the four capabilities that we discussed today may not exist within a single application. So either you have to actually refer to individual dashboards from these applications, or you should actually look at creating an application, what you call dashboard, that actually extracts information from each of these sources through the tool APIs and then puts that into a custom dashboard that you can create using a solution like Power BI or maybe like a Tableau, which is basically a dashboarding tool. And then if you're trying to implement these solutions, please be open for customization. You may definitely need to tweak these models or to tweak the process in order to get the required results. For example, if your performance testing dashboard by default is actually having 20 different parameters or widgets, all the 20 may not be useful for you. You may need to prioritize what is important for your customer's business or for your business in order to actually view, and then only have the things that are required. Or it can be in terms of a defect analysis solution. You're actually getting a third party is actually developing an app for you. He has come up with some algorithms that he has used when he was actually creating the tool. That algorithm may not work for your what you call data. So you should be definitely open for customizing the tool. It takes a good amount of time to implement this. So that's the last point that I have. One has to be really patient. What do you call? You have to actually show a lot of patience when you're actually implementing this. Otherwise, it's not going to happen on a fine day. Expect 2 to 3 months of time to get to a stable phase. So that's all what I had. I'm open for questions now. Thank you for listening in. I'm happy to actually answer any kind of questions that you might have on this topic. I think we have a question from Mohammed, right, on what are the best process around analyzing tickets or analyzing production feedback. So, Mohammed, I think that the most I've seen automation working to a great extent here because it may not be feasible to do this ticket analysis and all of those things in a manual mode. I actually, to be frank, there are two different aspects that actually made me think about production defect analysis or this topic maybe a couple of years back. One was basically I was talking to one of my what do you call friends who was actually working for one of the largest, maybe a Fortune 100 company, where they were having around 5,000 defects being reported on a monthly basis for all their applications. And they had two full-time persons in their team who was actually doing analysis of those defects to make sure that they are not performance-related issues. So this guy was actually working in a performance team, and his job was to make sure that his team is not responsible for none of these 5,000 defects that have come into production. And if there are defects that are related to performance, this team has to actually do a root cause analysis. So it was like two full-time people doing this manual job of analyzing each of those 5,000 tickets to make sure that it is either performance or just to classify them into performance and a non-performance kind of buckets. So automation really, what do you call, really help to actually remove those kind of overheads. The second aspect that actually made me think about this is basically I had a scenario where one of my what do you call friends was working in a company in UK actually had an issue on their retail website. So it was during the Christmas time, I think around 3 years back, when the application, when the e-commerce application that they were actually what do you call supporting started behaving slowly. So normally, like during the Christmas time, there are a lot of offers. People are actually buying in those products, and a lot of people on the website. It started behaving slowly, and unfortunately, their performance monitoring team was not what do you call available, or they did not have a practice around performance monitoring. They only had application monitoring. Somehow they did not actually notice the slowness. And what happened was people, their customers started reporting this problem, not in the ticketing tool or neither through email or phone calls. A couple of them posted what do you call entries within Twitter complaining about their website slowness, but none of their business or IT team saw these kind of posts. So what happened was after 3 hours, this website came down, and finally they incurred a loss of close to £1 million. So if there is an automated system that is actually looking at real-time, what do you call, comments and feedback that is actually coming in a forum like Twitter or a social media forum like Twitter or maybe Facebook, someone could have actually found this out, and then they could have taken a preventive action and saved at least, I would say, at least 900K. Not even, I'm not just talking about £1 million, but it is one. They could have actually made that website available for users, and they could have prevented a complete what do you call shutdown of their website due to slowness. So and if you cannot actually do these kind of things if you're actually looking at a manual mode, so definitely automation would really help. In this case, it's mostly real-time automation that's required in order to actually look at feedback in real time and then take corrective action. So this might require something like continuous monitoring of your applications from a quality standpoint. So very short answer, like always preferred mode is automated, but if you want to do a proof of concept to see the real value of these practices, yes, you can actually go with what do you call a manual mode for a couple of days. And once your management is, or once your leadership is actually convinced, you can think about moving towards an automated approach, which might require some investments.
Great explanation. Thank you. Thank you, George, for explaining such a love, explaining and giving us very information. Please join us our Discord channel by scanning the QR code for chat with our community or any community information or for your questions, testing queries, and so on. And once again, thank you all for joining us today with George for a wonderful session on production analysis feedback, which was very informative. And feel free to drop your valuable suggestions and feedbacks on our social media platform or our QA Talk website. And also, you can use our Discord app. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day, and thank you,
You
team,
too.
for the
Thanks.
opportunity. Bye bye.
Bye.